Hey everyone, welcome to part 10 of my React Redux and Webpack series. In our last video, we added some more functionality to our Redux actions and reducer, and we added functionality to our to-do list app so that it's actually, you can add a to-do, you can toggle completed, or delete a to-do. In this video, I'd like to go into a little bit more advanced topics, which is how to use multiple reducers to split your state tree. And then I want to talk a little bit about asynchronous code using Redux. So to start, let's talk about how our reducer is set up right now. Currently, we have one reducer that takes in all of the state and returns a new state every time, and this reducer is responsible for any and all actions on any and all parts of the state tree. So right now it makes sense to just have one because our state tree is just an object with a to-dos property that's an array. But in the case of a more complicated app, we might be keeping track of other things on state like user name or user ID or something like that, or UI state. Maybe there's a toggle that the user is toggling and we need to keep track of. And as you might imagine, our single reducer might get a bunch of these cases. They have to handle every part of the state tree, and this switch statement might be like a switch statement from hell. To combat this, although state in Redux is always one big tree, we can make multiple reducers that handle only specific parts of the state tree. And in this way, we can start to refactor our code and have specific reducers that handle only specific aspects of the state tree. This makes it easier to reason about and much easier on a developer, much more modular. So we're going to set that up. First, I want to set up a little bit the actual other data we're going to keep track of. So right now we have a to-dos property. I'm going to arbitrarily make a user property that's just an object with a username and a user ID. And we'll probably add a button on the app to like randomly assign a new ID or something like that, just to see how we actually do this. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add this kind of user data. So in my initial state on my entry point, which is client.js, I'm going to add my user property, which is just an object with a username, go Kurt, because that's me, and an ID of 13. I like that number. Cool. So this is my user name and ID and the user property. So the other place that we're going to want to handle, we're going to want to handle this user data and display it somehow. So I'm actually just going to make a header. Let's just make a user info component. We're going to import it. Let's actually make this file. I usually just copy and paste previously written components. Makes it a lot easier. So we're going to have like user and a username, and then we'll have something similar to that, but for ID, this.props.user.id, and then we'll have a button. We'll get rid of one of these buttons, and we'll have this handle new ID, and we'll say update with random ID. Cool. Let's just write this handle new ID function, and this is eventually going to dispatch an action. So let's write that action. Let's go create new ID, create new user ID, and it's a function and it's going to return an object like they all do, and it's going to have a type of create user ID. And we don't really need a payload here because the action is just going to create a random a randomly generated ID. And actually, the more I think about this, the more it might be hard to create a random ID in a reducer, because I'm not sure that that is going to be a pure function, because you don't know with an input you're going to get a different output. So we'd actually have to do that here. So we do need a new ID, and it's going to be math.rand. I got to check this out. So math.random gives you a number between 0 and 1, so we can multiply that by we can multiply that by 100, and we can take the first 2 digits to get a 2-digit number. So well, let's just multiply it by can you change this? I don't think so. Cool. We'll try something like that. So our app component, our user info component, is going to need this create new user ID, and it's going to be this dot props dot actions dot create new user ID. In our user info component, then we can actually dispatch this. So it's going to be this dot props dot create new user ID, and that's all we have to do. So we've got our action set up. We need to make the reducer be able to handle this. So we need another case. And in this case, we're going to return our object.assign state, a new object with user. The username is going to be state.user.username. We're not changing it. And then the ID is going to be action.id. Cool. Let's see what we got. I'm not sure if I did everything. I went through this pretty fast. I'm not trying to explain everything I'm doing here. What I'm trying to do is set up an app that's complicated enough where we have 2 properties on state tree. We have our to-dos and we have our user info. Once it's set up, then we'll get into more of the specifics of how to actually cannot read property username of undefined. So this is in our userinfo.js. Cool. So our user info is saying it needs a property props.user, and that's cool. So we just need to pass it down. User equals this.props.user. And I know this is all, or I think this is all here because we're mapping all of state to app. So app's going to have all of our state, and we initialized our initial state with this user. Let's see what happens now. It's still the same. I didn't save it. Save. Head back. Cool. So this looks really horrible, but we've got the username Kurt and the ID and a button. That's not working. Let's see what's going on. Math.random.slice is not a function. Let's just make it math.random. I was trying to get it so it has a it's in the actions. All right. JavaScript math round. Math.round. Cool. So we'll just math.round this whole thing to get a 2-digit number, hopefully. Let's see. Refresh the page. Boom. So now we're getting kind of random numbers going on here. So that's great. Now our state object has to-dos and a user, but we're kind of keeping track of everything in the same way with just one overall reducer, and it's handling all of the state at the same time. And this can just get, like I said, really long, really complicated. So let's learn how we can use a method from the Redux library called combineReducers that basically allows you to separate out your reducer functionality into separate reducers, combine them into one, which gets passed into your store configuration. But then anytime an action is triggered or dispatched, the state tree is split up into its component parts and passed to the specific reducers that you assign each part. Those reducers do their thing, which is check to see if they have an action that they can handle and handle it, and if not, it's just return their part of the state tree. And then the combined reducers takes the results of those reductions, puts them back together into one big state tree, and then you have your updated state. So I like, instead of having one file, when I'm going to split it up into multiple reducers, I like to make a folder called reducers and have each individual one in there. So let's go over here and let's do a little, let's make a dir in Redux and call it reducers. And then let's touch a new file called to-do reducer. Let's make one called user reducer. And let's make one that's just the index. This is what's going to actually combine our reducers together. We'll see how it works out. So our to-do reducer is going to have all of the functionality up to here, and then our user reducer is going to look very similar but only have one action that it can handle, which is this one. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to copy all of this into to-do reducer. Get rid of the user case here. I like renaming things just to keep it consistent. So this is to-do reducer. Now, the interesting part of this is there are a few things here that are kind of gotchas. It's not getting past, the to-do reducer is no longer getting passed in the entire state tree. It's instead getting passed in the one property that we are going to assign it, which is the to-dos property. And so we're not dealing with state here, we're actually dealing with to-dos. And it's not an object, it's an array. So interestingly, we have to change a few things in our code. So let's go through, and everywhere there's state, it's really just going to be to-dos. So we don't have to worry about objects because it's only going to be an array. And we don't have to worry about the rest of the state copying over because we're not handling the rest of the state. We're only handling to-dos. So we actually want to return another array. So we're not even returning an object here. And we don't have to give it a property to-dos. So we're returning an array with our new to-do here. We see here we're passing in state to get ID, but ultimately it's just going to be to-dos, and we don't have to reference it here. Okay, so this is just to-dos, and then we have the rest of, not state to-dos, but just to-dos that we get passed in. So that one's done. Here, again, there's no need for any of this. It's not on state, we're just on to-dos and we're mapping over it. And then of course, we don't need this. Is that? Right, guess this moves over. Yeah. And a similar thing here. It's not an object. And then our default is not to return state, but it's to return to-dos. So now this is all done. Let's copy this and make a user reducer. We don't need the helper function for the ID. Let's change this name to user reducer. This is not to-dos, but it's a user. Our default is just to return reducer, and we don't need any of these. We're going to go grab our case from our original reducer file, which is create user ID. And we're going to go back to user reducer. We're going to add this case here. We don't have to worry about adding state. And we're just going to be adding a user property with our username being the current username, and then the ID being the action .id that we're specifying from our action creator. Cool. So these two are done. So let's see how we actually kind of combine them into a system that can handle each individual part of the state and then combine it into a big one. And so to do this, we're going to use the combineReducers method from the Redux library. And again, none of these are really magical. This method is really just combining functions together. Just like higher order functional programming type stuff. So you can check it out in the source code if you want. We're going to define a constant called root reducer. We can use the const keyword because it's not going to change. And it's going to be the result of calling combineReducers on our individual reducers. And then of course we're going to export this. Cool. Now the object we pass in here is going to be basically mapping the properties on state to each reducer that we want to handle that property. So we have a property to-dos and we have a property user. And so our to-dos is going to be our to-do reducer that handles it. And then this is going to be our user reducer. And of course I'm referencing these but haven't imported them. So we are going to import to-do reducer from same folder to-do reducer. Copy this, do the same thing for our user. Cool. Now what we have to do, we can get rid of the original reducer file, don't need it. But remember, it's being referenced in our store. Our store configuration is eventually going to create our store with initial state and reducer. Let's make sure that our to-dos here, we have a user, it's just an empty object. Yeah. Instead of having just our reducer file here, we're actually going to import our root reducer from the folder reducers. And if you give the import statement a folder, it's just going to look for an index.js and import that, which is exactly what we want. So instead of down here, reducer, it's going to be our root reducer. Let's save that. We already have our initial state set up on our entry point, our client.js. And I think there's one extra thing we're going to need to do. And this is kind of a gotcha. It got me when I first started. Well, let's just see if it works, and then we'll see if we need it. So I save all my files. Let's go and let's run our server. Refresh our app. Yeah. So there's this uncaught error. It says reducer to-dos return undefined during initialization. If the state passed to the reducer is undefined, you must explicitly return the initial state, and it can't be undefined. If you'll remember, we had so what's happening here is that when we actually import our root reducer, it's looking to get, it looks for an initial state, and it loads in these individual reducers and looks for an initial state, and it kind of passes in initial state to make sure it's all good to go, I guess. This is a little hazy for me on why you need to do this, but you need to specify a default value here. So here it would be an array, and here it would be an empty object. The reason is because, well, how I like to think about it is I've set defaults here for initial state, but the root reducer has to be made before we get this create store with initial state. And I think during this initialization, which if we go back to the error says reducer to-dos return undefined during initialization, I think this root reducer and this combineReducers function needs, each of these needs to have their own default value, and it can't be undefined. So that was the issue. So if we make these ES6 syntax default values here, I think we'll be good to go. We save all that. Let's refresh the page. And yeah, so it looks like that error went away. Cool, we have an error here. In user reducer, state is not defined. So yes, remember, we're not dealing with state.user, it's just user. I forgot to make that change. I think I made all the changes in the to-do reducer. So I'm clicking it, and it kind of stopped working here for the ID, so let's see what's happening. We have our previous state, well, our first time we did it, we had a state of the user with an ID of 13, and then the next state that got returned had a user object and a user object inside of that object, which is not what we want. So let's see what's going on with our reducer here. Yes. So this object.assign is actually going to, it's actually going to return an object with a user property with this here. But remember, we're not dealing with the state object, which has a user property. We're dealing with just the actual user. We're actually getting thrown in just the user object itself. So we don't even need this object.assign. We just need to return the object. We're returning a new object that we're creating. So again, we're not modifying anything about it. We're returning a new object. Save all that. Refresh. And there you go. Now we've got IDs, new to-do, delete the to-do. So everything is now working as it should. Cool, so that was a little bit more advanced Redux. That was using separate reducers for separate parts of the state tree and then combining them together. I was going to talk about asynchronous code, but I think I've been talking for enough for right now. So I think I'll hold off for that till the next video. In the next video, we'll do asynchronous Redux handling. We will also then, in the video after that, look at how to style our application and make this maybe look a little bit better. And then eventually we will be getting into the development and production environments of Webpack and all this stuff. So with that, I'll leave you to it, and I'll see you here for the next video.